It is indeed an honor and privilege to welcome all of you to the session on financing climate action. I welcome all our distinguished speakers of the session who are here with us today. Some of our speakers are also joining virtually. I request our speakers to please come up on the stage. I now request our moderator, Mr. Bose Verghese, Senior Director ESG, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, to initiate the session. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Second day, second half. What's lunch? Let's see. So I'm representing Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, the largest full-service law firm in India. And a lot of you would be wondering why I am standing here as the ESG head of a law firm. So in the big picture, we figured, for a law firm, that full service is incomplete without ESG. Today, this space being increasingly regulated and being a part of everything that we do as, in everyday business. So getting into today's topic of financing climate action. This is a topic that we debated over the last 2 decades, I believe. And, it has never been more relevant or critical than it is today. We have always known that the cost of climate action is mammoth. People always talked about this in terms of trillions of dollars, percentage of GDP. And today, I think these numbers make a little more sense because we can kind of see the end point. Post-Paris Agreement, the whole 1.5 degree warming scenario and the need to make this planet net zero by 2050 sort of gives us an idea that it's going to take a lot of money to make that transition. Globally, the estimates are that, close to 5% of the GDP has to go into climate action every year. And that's definitely trillions of dollars. And, how do we come up with this huge amount of money? And that's a huge challenge. And in almost a decade ago, the UNFCCC had envisaged a Green Climate Fund of $100 billion that would be put up by the developed countries to support the developing countries. That remains a pipe dream even today. So nobody's really even talking about that today. And now if you look at a country like India, we are the third largest CO2 emitter. And our emissions are still growing. We are not expecting a peaking in the next few years. And an important part of our emission history, our historical emissions. If you look at our historical emissions, nearly 45% of that happened since 2010. That tells a lot about the pace at which we are growing. It also tells us about the stretch of road, the development road that needs to be covered for a country like us. So for us, there is this twin challenge to be overcome. You know, we need to continue to grow and develop, and we cannot be left behind in this new green economy. And we have already set this 2070 net zero goal. And financing this goal, the estimates are obviously in trillions of dollars. I've seen estimates of $10 trillion to $30 trillion, all really big numbers. The good thing is that we are a growing economy. So our GDP is going to grow, fast. And, this whole climate space is the clean tech space. There is a lot of investor appetite. There's a lot of money out there. So we have access to some of this money through, say, green bonds. A lot of Indian corporations are accessing, capital through green bonds. And I think it's hitting the news pretty regularly now. There is foreign direct investment available. And largely, I think, we will have to find this money internally. And how do we create policies and structures internally so that we meet these dual demands of transitioning to clean, low carbon economy, and therefore keeping pace with our 2070 net zero goal, as well as meeting our development priorities. We will find answers today, and we have a wonderful panel of 4 gentlemen today, and I'm sorry, I'm going to talk to joining us. And we have, I will start with, we have one of the panelists joining virtually. We'll start with him, Mr. Kamran Khan, Managing Director and Head of ESG Asia Pacific at Deutsche Bank. Welcome, Mr. Khan. And we have Mr. Manish Chaurasia, Managing Director, Tata Cleantech Capital Limited. Welcome, Mr. Chaurasia. And we have Mr. Tim Cook, Financial Counselor, Danish Embassy, New Delhi. And we have Debraj Sen, Managing Director and Head of Global Banking, North India, and India Lead, Sustainable Finance, HSBC India. Welcome to the panel. So I would request our panelists to come up and share what they are doing in their sphere of professional work in terms of advancing climate finance, what the challenges they are seeing, and what is the potential for clean financing in India, and lessons to be taken from practices elsewhere, all of those. I would invite Mr. Manish Chaurasia to first come up and share his views. Thank you.
Very good afternoon to the esteemed audience. And thank you, Mr. Verghese, for the introduction. I am from Tata Cleantech Capital. And Tata Cleantech Capital is a specialized climate finance company. In the last 7 years, we have funded over 300 projects. So there's a lot of experience with us, which I can share in this forum. As all of you are aware, this war against climate finance is based on 3 pillars. One is clearly the technology. And clearly technology has kept pace and improved over a period of time. Other is clearly the policy. On policy front also, a lot of actions from various governments a lot of push towards fight against global warming. And then third is the financing. And all these three have to move in sync if we really have to see the progress. Now, here I will talk in terms of the Indian context, because that is where we have experience. So if you see this sector in India, it has been dominated by the growth in renewable energy. First, it started with the wind sector, and slowly the solar took over. If you take the last 8 years, most of the funding, if you really aggregate it, then it is about 70 to 80 billion dollars. And a lot of this funding has come from international sources. A lot of it has come from the domestic sources. And the good thing is that we have found that there is no dearth of money, provided the projects are viable. Now, we have to see this in the context of what's going to happen in the next 8 to 10 years. Now, last 8 years, we have seen investment of about 70 to 80 billion. But in the next 8 years, up to say 2030, our expectation is that India itself requires more than $1 trillion. This will be dominated by renewable energy, which will probably take about 250 to 300 billion. Then a lot of investment will have to go into the storage, because going forward we just can't rely on plain vanilla renewable energy, because that depends upon the nature. We require storage so that the energy is more predictable. Apart from that, we'll see a lot of investments in electric vehicles. We'll see a lot of investment in creation of a green corridor and the distribution framework, meaning the distribution of electricity, where we require investment in smart meters and in other equipments. Apart from that, we will require investment in what is called bridge fuels, in say models like city gas distribution. So there are a number of sectors which will need money. And as I told you that the requirement is certainly more than $1 trillion, which is almost 15 to 16 times of what investments has happened in the last 7 to 8 years. Now the question is where this money will come from. Because when we talk about $1 trillion, that is almost 40% of the current banking asset book, which is around $2.5 trillion. And we talk a lot about housing finance. And if you take $1 trillion, that will be about 3 times the aggregate housing finance book in India. There are 30 housing finance companies in India. So what we feel is that while this looks a daunting task, but actually it may not be. Because one is that, as I told you, technology has kept pace. And today, a lot of the projects, when we talk about clean tech sector, actually viable projects. Today projects in solar sector, wind sector, even the projects with storage, even electric vehicles, today 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, even electric buses, their total cost of ownership is lower than the conventional vehicles. So almost 50% of the funding is possible provided the projects are viable. Now the question to be answered is that what are the issues which are impacting the viability of these projects? The key issue is that today India has a relatively weak institutional capacity. If you see most of the projects in say solar sector or wind sector, for that matter electric bus sector, the off-taker, the buyer of the energy or the service, basically either is state distribution companies or it is state transport utilities. Now, unfortunately, today the health of these government institutions is not in a great shape when it comes to the financial health. And this has to be seen in the context of the fact that today technology is moving very fast. If we just go back 7 or 8 years, the cost of solar power was almost 18 rupees per unit of electricity. Today it is down to about 2 to 2.5 rupees. And these kind of projects require long-term contracts. They require contracts for 20, 25 years to be really bankable. Now, suppose a project was set up in 2015, where the cost of power was, say, 8 rupees. In 2018, it probably became 3 rupees. But the contract which was signed in 2015 was for 25 years. And if the DISCOM had signed the contract in 2015, says in 2018 that I will not pay you 7 or 8 rupees because now the power is available at 3 rupees, then the whole structure falls flat. But there is no one who will be willing to invest. And in spite of the improvement in technology and in spite of the policy initiatives, probably nothing will happen. And this is what we have seen happening in India. For those of you who are not aware, this is what was done by the Andhra Pradesh government to the renewable sectors. The contracts which were signed were actually released. Fortunately, we have a strong legal system in India. And High Court gave the verdict that the contracts cannot be renegotiated. And hopefully things will get better there. So what I'm trying to say is two things. One is that we need to strengthen the institutional capacity. And we need to have a very strong contract enforcement framework. If these two things can be done, in my view, at least 50% of the funding problem is solved. Then coming to the next 50%, as important as putting up the project is to ensure that there is a supply chain. So today, when we have projects in India, say solar project, most of the equipments are imported, whether it is module or it is balance of systems. Now, this can create some kind of an issue in the long run in terms of pressure on our balance of payments. So if we really have to invest trillions of dollars into this sector, we need to create a very strong supply chain, framework. So we need to invest in manufacturing, which government of India is prioritizing through various schemes. But I think the focus needs to be much more. Today, when we talk about electric vehicles, it's very clear that in the next 7 to 8 years, two-wheelers, three-wheelers will be dominated by the EV segment. Even the electric buses and to some extent four-wheelers will be dominated by electric vehicles. But if most of the batteries are imported, if most of the other equipments are imported, it will create some kind of imbalance. So I think that's another issue which needs to be addressed. So these, I would say, are the main things. If this is done, then at least 75% of the issue is resolved. The other is that we need to somehow encourage sectors like green hydrogen. Because if you take the storage, which is very important for making the whole clean tech sector viable, the storage depends upon batteries. If it is only dependent upon batteries, then there will be an issue because batteries use rare earth metals. They are in short supply. And batteries have limited life. So we need to have an alternate technology. Unfortunately, green hydrogen looks very promising. So I think as a country, we need to invest in these new technologies. I gave example of green hydrogen. There are so many others. There are innovations in business models, innovations in battery technology, innovations in a lot of other sectors. In terms of aggregation of demand. So I think if I can really summarize 3-4 important factors, and I think if we can really work towards that, then this $1 trillion will look a small amount. And in fact, we have to look this more as an opportunity to grow than as a burden of investment. If we are able to do right things in terms of policies and in terms of investments, then our GDP will grow because of this, and it will not be a drag on GDP. So to summarize, one is that we need to strengthen the institutional capacity in terms of their ability to make payment. We need to strengthen the contract enforceability so that the willingness to make payment is there. Then we need to have very strong policies to ensure that the supply chain gets strengthened in India and the manufacturing happens in India. And lastly, we need to encourage sectors like green hydrogen and a lot of research. I think once this is done, then we'll find that this was actually an opportunity to grow, then to worry about from where the money will come from. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaurasia. I am not taking time to summarize it. He has already summarized his points. I would now invite Mr. Khan, who is joining us virtually. Please, if you can, speak for 5-6 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, sounds good. Can you see me and hear me? Okay.
Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, fantastic. So what I would like to do is just make maybe about 4 or 5 points specifically that might be worth considering, and then we can use some of that in the discussion perhaps. So the first thing, as you will probably see behind me, we have Deutsche Bank, which set up a ESG Center of Excellence here in Asia and based in Singapore. And it's important to know we didn't set one up in Frankfurt or London or New York. We set this Center of Excellence in Asia for a very good reason. What are those reasons? First, you hear a lot about the ESG movement starting in Europe, now spreading to North America. But in all my conversations, the one point that always comes up, and it'll come up again at COP27, is that if we as a global civilization cannot ensure that the future growth, future development in a region like Asia and a country like India is truly sustainable, not in words, not in sound bites, but in actual practice. So if the future growth doesn't happen sustainably, no amount of waste recycling in Europe is going to save the earth. Now, why is Asia so important? It's because if you look at the global supply chains, 60-70% of sourcing happens out of Asia, economies like India. That's where the whole world buys from. And if you look at the FDI over the last 2-3 decades, foreign direct investment, which is related to manufacturing facilities, distribution centers, and so on, again, 60-70% happening in Asia. So it's very, very critical to get Asia right. And it's very, very important to have a fast-growing economy like India be on the right track. So I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thanks CII for the invitation. Now, as we think about what is ESG and how to implement it, particularly in the context of economies like India, we have to recognize that there is no such thing as a copy and paste from Europe or North America into an fast emerging economy like India. So what do we do as Deutsche Bank ESG bankers? Our mandate is very clear. We have our own ESG taxonomy, which is tied very closely to the EU ESG taxonomy. So we have one standard across the world. The trick then is, how do you keep the standards where they are, but find practical ways to implement them in the jurisdiction where you're operating? And again, this is why I encourage young people to get involved in this, because the new breed of financial services industry experts is required to think about, how do we keep those standards? How do we understand the realities on the ground where we live and work, and make sure that the transaction coming out of all of that is world-class and credible, right? So that's what we do day in and day out. And why do ESG at all, right? What are the key drivers? So if you're an investor, there are two very clear things. One is physical risk coming out of environmental change, i.e. vectors hitting your portfolio, your returns. And then the second is more indirect. These are consequential, policy-related sometimes issues, that something happened, the heat waves come, the temperature rises, or whatever the case might be, that then has knock-on effects on other issues, which then hit your portfolio. So as an investor, you have to have an eyes wide open approach to your portfolio and say, am I exposed to ESG or not? And a lot of investors did this correction in 2020, both on environmental and social issues, and this process continues. Now, let's talk about corporates, which is the key constituency here. First of all, the pressure is coming, especially for companies that are selling in international markets under their own brand. Their pressure is coming from clients. If you're selling to a European company or a US based company, they probably have pretty strong ESG credentials and commitments. So for them, it's very important to make sure that people they are buying from are also on the same page. Otherwise, it hits what is referred to generally as scope 3 emissions, right? So the ills of your supplier become a problem of yours. The second is consumers. So I know 2 minutes, I'll be done.
Yeah.
Or 1 minute? Okay, yeah, I'm almost there. This second is consumers. So you want to have your branding, your market positioning. And then third, of course, is investors. So the trick really is, how do you take a commercial strategy of a company and figure out, is there a way to put ESG into it so that it is accretive to the value of the company? ESG should not come only at a cost. I always tell clients, if you're looking at your sustainability strategy and you can't figure out how that makes you a better company, more profitable, more competitive company, chances are you're looking at a public relations document and not really an ESG or sustainability strategy. And last bit I would say in terms of our focus is, if you look at the entire universe of companies, you have maybe 5% that are pure green. So these are the solar panel manufacturers and so on. There's a race of time. How quickly can we get renewable energy and other things in place? Then you look at the other extreme, there are 5% that are purely, in the non-ESG space. But a lot of the discussion happens about the two extremes, and the real game is in the middle, the 90%. We need to find ways to pivot them towards sustainable practices, and that's what really the focus ought to be. At the same time that we talk about energy security and green investments, which are very, very critical, we cannot lose track of the 90% that need to be incentivized to become sustainable. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Thank you for bringing up this global taxonomy standard that's being followed and the supply chain pressures, which is real. It's a real driver. And now I would invite Mr. Cook to probably share us how things are done in Denmark and maybe some lessons that we can draw from. Thank you. Yeah, you can come on.
Thanks very much. A lot of good things have been said already. I'd like to talk a little bit about Denmark, where I come from, and how we might, you could say, inspire India. Denmark has a green strategic partnership with India. We have set up a center of excellence for offshore wind, for green hydrogen. We have a close collaboration on water, on agriculture, and starting up on maritime. But I think also there are lots of lessons to be learned from Denmark to be given to India. Denmark is minuscule compared to India. India is really the place to focus if we want a sustainable world. As mentioned, it's the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. It has a huge expectancy for GDP growth a long time going forward. So it's really, really important to focus. And what we see from Danish side is that we can maybe pass on some lessons learned, and also inspire India. We've had a green transition in Denmark going on for maybe 5 decades. Our largest utility went, you could say, from black to green. And I think there's also a lot of lessons to bring from Denmark to India when it comes to financing. And that goes both when it comes to, you could say, many smaller financings from consumers, for instance, and when it comes to large-scale financiers and investments. But speaking of the journey of you could say, the Danish green transition, one key point that kind of illustrates how far we've gone. Years and decades ago, technology was not there. The renewable energy technology was not there to be commercially viable. So it needed quite a lot of subsidies. Denmark was one of the first countries developing wind energy. Needed a lot of subsidies for a long time, small projects, getting a bit bigger, lessons learned, and so on. It took decades, but not very far back. Recently, the largest offshore wind farm was had a tender out. It was for 1 gigawatt offshore wind. And tender by the state was won with a minimum price of 0.01 Danish kroner per kilowatt hour. So that's about INR 0.1 kilowatt hours, sorry, INR per kilowatt hour. Now, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because there is a strong track record, a strong belief also in the market, and there is a strong and big pipeline going forward projects. There's a strong, well-developed regulatory system that has a lot of trust from investors and financiers. So all in all, it's remarkable, the journey that has gone, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned that can be passed on, and a lot of inspiration that we hope to be able to pass on. It takes time, and as you mentioned, you cannot afford setbacks like you could say ruining the sanctity of contract, taking back contracts that have been signed. That's really a no-go for attracting investments and financiers in the future. There's also a few points to take on from financing, lessons learned from Denmark when it comes to, you could say, many small paths lead to a big road ahead. Lots of what is financed of renewable energy is actually financed by pension funds. And this also comes very much with, you say, customers vote with their feet, but also Danish retirements, pensioners, they vote also with their money, and a lot of the pension funds are owned and governed by the members. So they look for sustainable investments, and they put their money where they see sustainable investments and the ESG agenda being taken seriously. So I think I'll stop there. There's many good examples. Also, like crowdfunding for big projects and co-ops being made. There's a new regulation that future wind farms will need at least 20% ownership, or can have up to 20% ownership by local citizen groups through cooperatives. So there's a lot of things, and I think some are maybe not for this year in India, but it's good to take from lessons learned from Denmark and be able to bring them forward in India. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of potential, and there's also a necessity to bring them forward very fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. I'm sure the bilateral cooperation will lead to a lot of learning, and especially the offshore technology. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Davirat Singh from HSBC to share his views.
Thank you. Good evening to all of you, and greetings from HSBC. I think I had quite a few eminent speakers talk before me, and in order to stick within time, I'll just talk about a few specific issues so that we are broadly on time. I think what we are trying to talk about here is how do we finance the sustainable transition for the world at large and India specifically. Let me, for the sake of the audience, lay the enormity of the task in terms of just one number. There have been quite a few modeling studies done with regards to India's aim to transition to net zero by 2070, and that's 20 years after many countries said they would. And the question that was trying to get answered there was, what will it cost us? The answer is somewhere in the vicinity of $10 trillion. Now, put this in the context that India as a country has a GDP of about $3.53 billion today, and we are talking about getting to 5. So our GDP size is currently 3.53, and you are talking about $10 trillion of investment requirements if you were to reach net zero by 2070. The good news is, of course, that we are at 2022, so we have about 48 years to get there. Now, I am pretty confident, and I would probably hope my co-panelists agree with me that the best expert in terms of finance in this world can't really give you an answer as to how the world is going to get the enormous amount of money that is needed to reach where we need to reach. And we are talking about India. There are so many other countries in the equal stage of development. None of the countries want to compromise in terms of their growth story. So they do not want to really stutter their own growth ambitions just to reach net zero, barring Bhutan, which is a very different example. They are a net negative carbon contributor, but that's a different story. So essentially, coming back to India, the story that I see play out for India and as laid by the government of India, and we are quite fortunate that the government of India has taken this task very, very seriously. We see the tone from the top to be very, very confident. The intent is absolutely there in terms of government support coming in, but broadly to lay the building blocks, there are 4 building blocks that India is talking about. One is the renewable. I think on that, India's story is going pretty well. Our aspiration was, of course, to put 175 gigawatts by 2022. That is getting a bit delayed for a variety of reasons, lockdowns and inflationary risk, customs duty, etc. But broadly, the very fact that 50 gigawatt of solar capacity has come in pretty well. We are possibly the second biggest renewable market right now when you look at it from a attractiveness point of view. So the renewable story to me is the easy story. It's a technology which has played out pretty well. Risk capital, be it debt capital or equity capital, has taken pretty well to that. They understand the product. It's a question of, as Manish very rightly pointed out, if a project is bankable. And of course, the challenges have been in India that the prices have been dropping and the DSCRs have been on a ever declining path. Probably, I think as a country, we know how to get there. So when the Prime Minister says that we want to be 500 gigawatts by 2030, I see no reason why we should not be there. I see no reason why capital availability for that sector should be a problem. As a global international bank, we see enormous amount of interest from investors all across the world to come and play in this sector. We have, I think somebody mentioned about some of the Canadian pension funds and some of the larger institutional investors already picking up stakes in some of the large renewable companies. That will definitely help the sector. as well as bank financing is pretty easily available if your project is right. So renewable is the easy part. Let's come into the parts that do not look easy as of now. The second part, the most important part, is the e-mobility part. And e-mobility, there will be two parts to it. One, the two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers part of it, and the other part of it is the freight electrification, which is a very different challenge. I think currently the problem, and you may all be aware of it, is the risk of a new technology is actually impeding a lot of financiers to sit on the sidelines so far. Because essentially it's a new technology and the residual value of the battery, which is 50-60% of the value of the EV, is undetermined. There is no benchmark available for the residual value. And essentially finance works on a residual value of the collateral. So that's an issue. There have been calls to evolve a very specialized EV financing mechanism that is in the works by most institutions. But we see early traction there. The very fact that in India, e-mobility, the sector has grown at 666% over the last 2 years. It is amazing. The growth has been the highest in three-wheeler segment, followed by two-wheeler segment. Four-wheeler, we haven't seen that many volumes, but then India to really make a net reduction in the emission, three-wheelers and two-wheelers, which really help the last mile mobility, that's very important. So we need to really solve for the problem on the e-mobility sector. And that's in words. I can't say that there is a solution available, but, and I'll come to this part a bit later, with the help of certain multilaterals, there are some work happening. The electrification of freight is a massive challenge because I was in a WEF discussion yesterday, and what I understood is that the preference is for 40-feeters. Trucks that can carry the 40 feet kind of containers. And the product availability is still not very defined. India does not yet have a manufacturing base. Globally, the Volvos, the Daimlers, they are all working towards getting that in place. But unless that product problem is solved, electrification of freight is not going to happen. But if it gets solved, it becomes easier because essentially you will have players like the Daimlers or the no preference for any of the players, but those global majors, and we'll also have on the other side very credible counterparty buyers. So say a Flipkart or a Amazon using those, or L&T using those, and you have two counterparties who are pretty bankable for you to go ahead and bank. So this is the problem that needs to be solved for. The third part, and which is where India is talking about having 6% of its energy demands met by green hydrogen. So the green hydrogen story is big. Today, you walk into any conference, people are talking green hydrogen. Of course, everybody is aware of the commercial price challenge to that while Mr. Ambani has talked about $1 per kg, the current prices are about $5 per kg. But having said so, this country is still probably the cheapest option for green hydrogen to be manufactured. And therefore, the whole green hydrogen plan also has an export component to that. The good thing for us is that currently the kind of players that we are seeing backing this, the Reliances of the world and some of the other alliances, there's a Green Hydrogen Alliance which has been formed in the country. That makes us pretty optimistic that this will be solved for. But again, it is a new technology, and the biggest risk is, the long-term offtake of that, for which the government needs to obviously take a lot of actions in terms of how the offtake and a long-term offtake contract is available. And if that gets sorted out, the finance availability for that sector should not be a problem. And I think finally, just keeping it brief, overall corporate action. That's extremely important because to have seminars like this is very important, but unless we actually act it out in our own corporate lives, corporate constituents, it will not play out. So I think the first move by SEBI to have the top 1,000 listed companies adopt as a mandatory measure the BRSR is a welcome step. And once that starts playing out, we will actually see that distill down and more players coming into it. We can, of course, get into issues like scope 3, supply chain and all that. My last point is that, okay, having said all of the above, what is HSBC doing? I think globally we have made it very clear in terms of our intent. We have publicly made an announcement way back in October of 2020 that we are committing between $750 billion to $1 trillion to work with our partners in terms of their transition journey. And India is a very, very key market for us. You will be very surprised that 13% of our Indian balance sheet is now consisting of sustainable assets. So we are doing our part, and I'm sure all of you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sen, and for detailing really the logical transition levers and challenges with each of them. And now we are not left with a lot of time, but I would like to pose at least a question each to each of you. And I'm going to go to Mr. Khan first. And I'm hoping, we've heard about this whole green hedging transaction done by Deutsche Bank. And that is something, new in this space. If you can just provide some insight into that, how does that work?
Sure. Thank you. Look, first, you know that there's a significant amount of capital being raised in hard currency that is moving to emerging markets like India. And we, like some of the other banks who are here, are on the forefront of that, advising Indian clients to raise capital outside India. Now, the question becomes, you could have a transaction that is fantastically green, but it still needs to be managed financially in a very prudent manner for the whole thing to work together. So no point having a very green transaction that's not managed well from a financial standpoint. So having a hedge to start with is a very, very critical thing. And you'd be surprised, maybe not with the bonds, but with a lot of loans, some of the companies in emerging markets haven't been quite as steadfast in terms of covering all the risk. Then comes a second question. So let's say I'm an investor into this green bond, and I look at the the green bond framework, and I know the eligibility of the projects that are going to be considered, and I can get comfortable with it. And I have my LPs, let's say I'm an institutional investor or fund manager, I have my LPs to whom I'm reporting that I'm buying this green bond. Now imagine in the hedge transaction, there are other counterparties involved that may or may not have, or there's at least a chance that some of them may have some questionable credentials with respect to ESG. So without even recognizing that, I bought the bond, but the bond is hedged through some third parties that have not so stellar an ESG reputation. It makes sense for the hedge itself to also have a framework which clarifies what the terms of the hedge would be from a financial perspective, but also what the ESG markers on the hedge would be, what you will be willing to do and what you will not do for the hedging transaction based on the commitments you have made for the bond itself. So that's the kind of transaction we did, which was the green hedge. It was the first one in Asia. We think perhaps the first one around the world of its kind. And then we've been doing quite a few other ESG-linked derivatives that are attached to ESG KPIs. So these are not in general, not use of proceeds type of transactions. These are very specific to 3 or 4 or 5 metric that the company says, I will do A, B, and C, D. And there's a penalty attached to that. So whenever you hear the term ESG linked, that means there is a penalty attached to not achieving the target that is agreed upon. And that's a very important incentive to the issuer to make sure that they actually follow through on their commitments.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Now, I like to come to you, Mr. Razia. So there's a lot of talk about disclosures in many regimes in the UK, in the US, SEC. A lot of talk about enhanced climate disclosures. And do you see? We have one BRSR, and there are from other regulatory authorities like RBI, there are early discussions on making climate risk disclosures mandatory. Do you see that really driving investment in this sector, having a big impact?
See, it's universally true that what is not measured is not monitored. So the fundamental thing to make changes as far as corporate India is concerned is to nudge them or to force them to measure the emissions, measure the water footprint, measure the plastic footprint. So I think we are speaking about the business responsibility and sustainability reporting. I think that's a very positive step taken by CII. But I would say it's a first step. So initially we have to nudge companies into, and this is applicable for 1,000 top listed companies. So we have to nudge companies into measuring their footprints on carbon, on plastics, on water, and so on and so forth. And after they've done that, then we have to find ways how they can reduce it. So I think this is a very important development. But still, I would say this is just the first step. It has to be followed by more effective regulations. That is what is my view.
Thank you. Now I have a question for you, Mr. Sen. The whole ESG taxonomy, Mr. Khan referred to it, is becoming more and more commonplace. Do you, as a bank, follow a taxonomy globally? How does that sit in India, that kind of a framework?
I think I would like to differ with you slightly here. The EU taxonomy is what the world has currently. Parallelly, there are a lot of work happening across many countries, many regions, which sort of takes inspiration from the EU taxonomy, and there seems to be a race to setting standards, but they're still not out. Now, one of the key challenges that we saw within the country, and we were talking about how will capital flow in. I think having a taxonomy in place for a country really helps that capital flow in because things are pretty well settled. So as far as India is concerned, there is no sustainable finance taxonomy right now. But having said that, and I can talk from experience here, I'm part of a working group, India-UK working group under the aegis of FICCI, which is working on a sustainable finance taxonomy, which we are advising the government of India to look at. Substantial work has happened. Of course, as I said, the EU taxonomy happens to be an inspiration. As far as coming to HSBC is concerned, I think currently what we are looking at is the APLMA, which is the Asia Pacific Loan Market Agency guidelines as far as green loans are concerned, green bonds are concerned. So we are sort of, so say for example, within Asia, we have a sustainability committee which looks at every particular deal before they approve whether it is a green label transaction or not. And I think mostly that is relying on the APLMA guidelines on loans and bonds.
Thank you so much. So we have now just about 5 minutes. I can ask a question to Cook or Mr. Cook, or we can take a question from the audience. Maybe if you can just quickly, this whole taxonomy, is it widely applied in Denmark?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say it is, but it's also. Yes, it is. But we've also had variations of ESG taxonomy being developed over years. But I mean, now since it's also applied on a wider scale in EU, that's the go-to place. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take, depending on the length of question and response, 1 or 2 from the audience. Okay, I'm there. You raised the hand first.
Hi, this is Anirban Chatterjee from DNV, one of the assurance provider in the sustainable finance and climate finance space. So very interesting insights from all of you. Just one question, any of you can answer. Now, what we are looking at also a lot of convergence of the standards and ESG due diligence becoming mainstream as part of the lending process or even a overall portfolio management for financial institutes and to the extent asset managers. How do you see that India is adopting these changes to some extent to the European or Western investors or banks? And being a global bank like HSBC, how do you see that the role of, assurer, role of independent reviewers, even rating agencies for that matter, plays an important role?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
So I am bringing to answer that.
yeah, sure.
There is a huge asymmetry right now in the banking market in India. Okay. And I think if anybody is more interested in that asymmetry, there is a report by Climate Risk Horizons, which essentially ranked 35 top market cap banks in India in terms of their overall preparedness, readiness in their own standards as far as climate risk management and sustainable finance is concerned. And the report is not very surprising in terms of where most of the local banks and the public sector banks stand, but there are some standouts as well. I think to that extent, banks such as Deutsche or HSBC benefit from the fact that we are a global bank. We have been working on this for a very long period of time. And therefore, the readiness with which we have been working not now, but for the last quite a number of years on this has been substantial. So we are quite up the chain. In fact, I would refer to the latest discussion paper that the Reserve Bank of India has come out on climate risk and sustainable finance. And it's a very comprehensive paper, 20-25 page, but it's worth a read. It has also for inputs from the banks as to what they think about it. We think it's a step in the right direction. It shows that the regulator is indeed now trying to get all the regulated entities take this job very seriously. Coming specifically to your question, I think assurance is very important from a neutral third party. Otherwise, as I think Manish was mentioning, it does not really. So as we have more instruments play a role in the financing, more loans or more sustainable loans, you will need to have independent third-party assurers take a look at it and assuage the concerns of the investors that what they are buying into is not a greenwashing product, but a genuine product. So I do see a good role for this.
I'd just like to add to that. See, today, a lot of this, so on a structural basis, the changes will happen once, say, RBI comes out with a firm policy. Right now, as Dibrat said, they have come out with a discussion paper. So today, what is happening is that some international institutions, foreign banks, multilaterals, even private equities, they follow certain standards. It can be TCFD, it can be IFC principles. So they are mandating their investee companies into following certain standards on ESG. So that's how it is happening, not in a very structured way, but it is still happening. Hopefully it will happen in a structured way soon. Yeah, once the regulations form up. That's where it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time, unfortunately. We have to close and we are all here. I think we can catch up outside the podium. Just to summarize, I think, on a positive note, while we need a huge amount of money to carry out this transition, money is available. That's good news. And as technologies become more viable and fundable, money is waiting. And I think technologies are breaking the cost barriers, year on year. And as a country, we are also growing. Our GDP is growing. I think on a positive note that we will make it, I would like to close the session. Thank you to the panelists, Mr. Khan, who has joined from Singapore, Mr. Shorazia, Mr. Cook, and Mr. Sen. Thank you very much. And thank you, CII, for giving this opportunity. Thank you.
We thank our distinguished dignitaries for this interesting and enriching discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we conclude this session. We request all of you to please be seated as we now have our next session on closing plenary of the summit. Post-summit, I request all participants to kindly drop their lanyards at the registration counters so that we can reuse them for the